Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carlos. I'm a web developer based in Brooklyn, New York, and today we're going to work on a project called CodeKeeper. We're going to be working on the model layer, and we're going to be writing some tests for that. This is part of the test-driven development course. Now, in order to complete this project, you should be familiar with the Mongoose library and MongoDB. You should also know how to make models and schemas, how they're designed, the structure of how a path is defined. You should be familiar with model testing patterns. We're going to be writing certain functions for testing our models and some hooks to actually incorporate into our tests. And you should also be familiar on how to implement test-driven development flow. We're going to be using the red, green, refactor flow. So we're going to be writing tests that will fail, then writing code that will make the test pass, and then refactoring that code. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start the project. Okay, in this project, we'll be completing the test suite for CodeKeeper. Right now, there's a feature and server test that can, one, verify that a user can enter code information, two, that it can post it to the server, and three, that we can view the information in the return web page. And we have these tests at passing, but we can't store or actually organize any of our code data anywhere. So you can actually see our test that we have written before in index test for the routes. And you'll have a bunch of other files here. Don't worry too much about what's contained in them because we'll go over them as we go through the steps. I'm actually going to close a couple to make a little more space for us to see. And if you close them accidentally, you can click this folder icon at the top left and you'll be able to navigate through the project. Okay, so we're going to be working using MongoDB to actually create a model and schema. We're going to be using Mongoose's package to actually interact and with our model and create database connections. And we're also going to be using our chai assertion module to create our asserts and our unit tests. So without further ado, let's go into step one here. So starting out, we're going to be read at the server and model. So they've added a second server test that verifies that a quote document is saved to the database. Let's go to our index test here. And this is the test we're talking about. So in our server test, we have one for the post request in the root page. And there's another one in the server level that stores the quote. So let's just run our test suite to see what we get. Okay, seems like our tester post stores the quote. This guy here seems to be failing because there's a reference error quote is not defined on line 46, so it doesn't know what this is. Okay, due to this, for this reason, we're actually working on our model now. So let's move on to step two. So now we're in the model layer. We're going to be writing a test to drive the development of the quote model. So let's go to our code test.js file, and we're simply going to import the modules that we're going to be working with. You can just grab them and copy paste them here. So you should be familiar with chai at this point. We're just going to be making our assertions for this, and these Mongo related variables, they're grabbed from the database. So we can see we actually navigated from our tests models from here. It went 2 directories up into the root folder, and then we grabbed content from the variables from the database.js file. I have that right here next to it. So let's go ahead and save that, and then we'll start writing our describe blocks. Okay, in our describe block, we're going to write the first one for the quote model. And within those, we're going to be writing some hooks that actually connect to the database to remove existing data and dropping it, and then after each hook that will disconnect from the database. So let's write our first describe block here. We're going to be testing for our quote. Make sure you pass a callback function here. Okay, and here we're going to write our before each and after each hook. So a quick refresher, the before each hook simply contains code that runs before every test in a describe block, and the after each hook contains code that runs after every test in a describe block. So in our before each hook, first we want to just simply connect to the database, and then we want to remove existing data by dropping the database. So let's start by running before each, and we're going to make sure that we're using asynchronous functions. So mark your function as async, and then we can actually await the connection of our database. So we'll type await mongoose.connect. We're going to be passing the URL of the database we're connecting to and some configuration options here. So database URL options. And after we connect, we want to drop the database because we don't want our unit test to be mixing in with other data from previous unit tests. So this is going to be applied for every single unit test. So we want to drop anything that was contained in the previous test possibly. So mongoose.connection.db and then simply call the function drop database. Okay, and for our after each hook, we're also going to use an asynchronous function here, so mark it with async. And we're simply disconnecting the database here. So mongoose disconnect. So the await keyword here will pause the execution of the function until this is completed, and then it will continue to this function here. So it just a synchronous function just make asynchronous operations be read in a more synchronous way, or be written in a more synchronous way. Okay, now let's go ahead and save this. Perfect. We can move on to step 4. So below the hooks, we're going to create a describe and an it block to verify that quote is a string. So quote will probably be a path that we're going to be defining eventually on our model, and we want to ensure that whenever someone stores a quote, that it's in the type of a string. So within the block, we're going to create a new quote and with a quote attribute and assert that the return instance is a quote attribute of the same string value. Okay, so let's create our describe block here, and this grouping of tests will be applied to our quote attribute here. So let's pass a callback function, and in here we're going to write our it unit test. So what do we want to test? We want to make sure that the quote attribute is a string. So pass in your callback function here. I'm going to add some space to make this more readable. Okay, so we need to create a variable here that we're going to be passing into the creation of an instance of our quote model, and then we'll call an assertion here to make sure that the expected value and the return value, the actual value, is the same. Now I'm going to type in a variable as an actual number here. So I'm going to type in a variable called quote as int, and I'm going to be passing that as a quote. And the reason I'm doing that is because Mongoose will cast any kind of mismatched data types to the specified schema type. So if we go into our model and we specify that our quote attribute should be a string, for example, if we entered 1, then Mongoose would cast the entry so that it enters the database as a string. So it will change this into 1. So that way, using casting, just Mongoose ensures that string properties are assigned string values. Okay, so now we can actually create our instance here. I'm going to grab the example here, and instead of passing these dots, I'm simply going to pass in the variable I just wrote. And now I can actually call our assertion here. So I'm going to make some space. Assert. We want to make sure it's a strict equal. Strict equal is the same as using 3 equal signs, so it's going to check for the value and the data type as well. So we have our citation, which is an instance of our quote model, and that citation has an attribute quote. So when we created this, we put in the quote as int as the actual quote. So we want to check the actual value, which would be citation.quote, and that should equal the expected value quote as int, but we want to change that manually to a string because we don't expect a number. So we can simply call toString on a quote as int. Go ahead and save that, and then we can move to step 5. Okay, in step 5, we're going to run the test. Make sure you actually save. I get paranoid about saving, so just do it frequently. Run your test, and now we get some new errors here. We get 2 type errors, and we get we get 2 type errors here. It seems like the property connect of undefined on line 7 and line 11. So if you look here on line 7, we see that this property is not being connect doesn't attach to Mongoose. So Mongoose is undefined. And the same happens in line 11, which is right here. So it doesn't know what Mongoose is. This is undefined, and it can't call .connect on undefined. So the reason is because if we look in our database file here, the variables that we imported in line 2, they're all commented out in our database file. So we just simply have to uncomment these variables here, save them, and make sure if you haven't already to install Mongoose. Okay. Now we can run our test one more time. Okay, now we don't get the reference errors we had earlier. And just in case, if you were wondering, this chunk here, so you can see our test here for our quote model, and specifically the quote attribute that we're testing. You see the failure, but before that, you see this big chunk of warning. Now I'm going to leave this because I think you might, if you're working with the same version of Mongoose as I am, it'll just be easier for you to interact with this. But just in case you were wondering, certain versions of Mongoose are updated. So a lot of times certain features are deprecated and no longer useful for the library. So even though they're not going to produce errors, they might still give you warnings here. And you can read the warning itself. It pretty much specifies what the problem is. The use Mongo client option is no longer necessary in Mongoose 5, whatever comes after that. So you can remove it. Now you can look in your database file. You'll see that the use Mongo client here, we're passing that as an option when we connect to our database here. So you could simply remove that and you won't get this big warning. I'm going to leave it because I want to make sure that you kind of follow the same flow that I'm doing. But if this annoys you, simply remove this variable here, remove it from the exports, and remove it as well from the parameter here that we're passing in when we connect to the database. But you'll be seeing this warning as I work through the project. Don't panic, it's simply a warning. It's not breaking our code. Okay, well, let's see what's failing now. We're working on the same test. The quote is a string. The reason it's failing is because quote is not defined. That means the model is not defined. We haven't really created any models, so we have to actually go into our models folder and create a model and schema from that. Okay, so in model quotes.js, which is right up here, we need to import Mongoose from database and create a schema with one path where the quote is of type string. Okay, so I'm going to import, since we already installed Mongoose in the project, I can simply grab it from wherever it was already grabbed. I'm going to grab it from the database file. So we're in models file here. We got to navigate one directory up, and then we have access to our database.js file. So let's go ahead and go and import it from there. Okay, and now we can create our actual schema. And our schema simply defines the shape of the documents within the collection. So this will basically shape how we're going to store the documents. So I'm going to call this a variable called code schema. We're going to create it by typing mongoose.schema. And we'll pass an object here where we'll specify what the structure of the schema will be. So we're going to call the path quote, and we're going to want to make sure that the type for that path is a string. If you want to go the extra mile, you can even add validators here that's required true, but we'll just stick to the data type for now. So let's go ahead and save that, and we can move on to step 7. So our model will basically be able to take the schema and create an instance of a document that's equivalent to the records in the database. So naming convention for when we use models is to just use a capital letter. So I'm going to write our model variable as quote with a capital Q, and then we can simply call .model on Mongoose to create model. We'll pass in the name quote, and we're going to apply our quote schema that created above. Okay. And now we have to actually export our model. So go ahead at the bottom of your file, type in module exports, and export your quote model. Go ahead and save that. So once we export it, we can go to our test file and actually finally import our quote model. So this is no longer a reference error. So go ahead and type post quote require, and we have to navigate all the way into our quote folder here. So if we are in here we have to go up one folder into test, once more into our root directory, then into our models file folder, and then we can get access to our quotes model. So we got to navigate up twice, down into our models folder, and then into quote. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. Okay, let's go on into green and refactor add model. So now that we actually have a reference, this shouldn't be failing. So let's run the test. Okay, and if you see this reference error here, that's because that's actually a test for a route or server test level. If this is the test we're passing, remember that warning here. So this is the test we wrote right over here. This test is passing. So we actually got the reference for quote, and we're able to create an instance of it and store it. Okay, perfect. The model passes, and now we're going to do a little refactoring. Since we're in the last section of our red-green refactor process, we can now refactor our model test. So we're going to do that by extracting the hook methods, all this logic here. We're going to extract it out, and we're going to put it into a helper functions which are found in database. Now, to begin refactoring, we need to create two functions in database and that execute the same method calls as the hooks that we wrote, and then we need to export them. So we actually did this in a previous exercise. I'm going to use connect and drop for the before each function. I'm just going to, naming convention, I'm just going to call it connect and drop. And for the after each, I'm just going to call it disconnect. So let's go ahead and type our functions here. Const connect and drop. You got to make sure this will be equal to an asynchronous function, and it takes no parameters, right? I'm going to leave it blank for a second. Let me create my other function here. It will be another asynchronous function. Here we go. And now I'm just going to grab the logic from our before each hook, paste it in here. Let me unindent this a little bit. And I'll do the same with our after each hook here. Oh, there we go. Tab. Go ahead and save this. Make sure you're also exporting them. So connect and drop here and disconnect. Perfect. Okay, so we grabbed the logic from the hooks and we just extracted it and put it here and exported it. So let's go ahead and move on to step 9. So in our quote test file, we now can import the helper functions and use them to replace the current expressions in our hooks. So these hooks here, the variables we imported, we don't need to import all of them because if you look back in your database file, we are actually feeding in these variables into our functions. So the connect and drop will know what database URL is and what options are, and we don't need to actually pass all of this into our quote test file. So all we have to do here is simply pass in the two functions, connect and drop, and disconnect. And after that, we can simply replace the logic in here with those callback functions. So connect and drop will be used for the before each hook, and disconnect will be used for the after each hook. So no logic has really changed. All we simply did is extracted code from here, passed it into database, and then imported it back in there so it's a little easier to read. So after you save this, save both files, your test should be the same. So I'm going to clear my terminal and I'm going to run npm test. So we'll still get a post server, post request server level failing, but our other test should be failing. And it seems I have an error here. It seems on database.js. That's because I misspelled disconnect. You might have caught that. So go ahead and run your test again. Okay, now we still have our test passing. Nothing's really changed. The only thing is the server level test is failing as expected. Perfect. So let's move on to step 10. Now we're going to be red at server level. So now we're going to be working with this failing test over here. So now that you've incorporated MongoDB and Mongoose into your project, you can use a new quote model and the database in your server test. So we can import the model file, database file, and the hooks into our routes index.test.js file. So let's go into our test index.test.js file, and let's look back into what line it is failing here. So you'll see quote is not defined. We get a reference error on line 46. So right here, doesn't know what quote is because we've never imported the model. So we actually have to import it now. So let's go ahead and import our quote model here at the top. So where are we again? We are in our test for routes. We have to go up one directory, two directories, down into models, down into quotes. So we got to navigate twice up into models and then into quote. Okay, save that. And we need to import our hooks as well. So let's go ahead and import them. Connect and drop and disconnect. Where are we importing them from? Let's go ahead and navigate there. So we are in our index.test.js file here. Right in here. We got to go up once, twice into the root directory, and then into the database file. So we'll go once, twice, and then we have access to database. We're not done yet. We have to actually implement the hooks in our test file. So you got to make sure you do these hooks right in the top of your describe file. Up at this block here. So we can simply core the same way we did here. Actually, I can just grab and copy paste these guys. Right here. So this will be ran within every unit test. Okay, go ahead and save that, and then we can move on to step 11. So let's go ahead and run the tests. Once again, I'll clear the terminal, and we can write npm test. Okay, now we get a new error. We no longer get the reference error, and if you get an exceeded timeout, that's probably because your hooks were not written properly or placed in properly. You should be getting a type error for the property quote of null. And look at the line as well, line 52 here. So let's scroll back down here. So it's saying that this citation is undefined, and therefore it cannot read the property quote of undefined. The reason is because we're working with server levels here. So we're sending post requests, but we're not actually storing any data on the server level. So we know we're working with our servers here, so we can go into our index.js file, and this is basically where our handlers, route handlers are being created. We have a get request for our main page for that renders an index page, and here's where we're creating the post request that will send data. So right over here, we have to one, import our quote model, and two, uncomment this line, where it would actually create the quote model once a post request is sent. So let's look back into our test for the routes here. We're sending the post request, we're trying to create a quote, but we can't create it because in a route level, there's no quote model imported, and we're actually not creating anything from the past information here, which will be these variables here that we're passing. So let's import our quote. And this should be, I believe it's maybe one directory up to our routes here. So yeah, one directory up. And then we can actually grab it from the models here. So we'll go up one directory, down into models, and then into quote. And let's uncomment this line here. So now when we actually hit this post request, it will know what a quote is, it would actually create it. And when you look at your test, it will persist into the server level here, and it will actually create its citation here. So let's go ahead and save that. Perfect. Let's move on to step 12. So now let's run our test one more time. Okay, we get a new error now. We get an assertion error. We expected undefined to equal Mary Shelley. This is on line 53. So we know that this passed already. There was no error there. Our code executed up to here. It stopped right here, and that's because attributed is doesn't exist, and it's trying to equal it to Mary Shelley. Now that's because in our model here, we actually don't have an attributed path here. So we actually need to actually put that in. So let's move on to step 13. So in our quote test.js file, below the quote test, let's go back here. We're going to add similar tests for the attributed and source properties. So we're back to red in the model. Remember, we don't want to add the path here first. We want to write our test first and then write our code to pass the test, and then we can refactor. Okay, so we need to add the test here for attributed and source properties of the quote model, and then we have to run them. For these two tests, you should force you to define the additional paths in the model, and then for each one, we're going to create a quote instance with a desired path, and then verify that the path is a string. So we're going to check that when we create an instance of our model with a new attributed and a new source, we want to check that we get a string and that we also get the same actual value that we passed in as a variable. So they're actually going to look quite similar to this quote test that we actually wrote here. I'm going to do that below here. So we need a describe to be specific to what path we're going to be testing. We'll test attributed. We'll pass a callback function. And then inside here, we'll write our it test. It'll be the same is a string. Pass in a callback function here as well. And then here we're going to pass in an attributed. So let's say we have a quote. You can do any kind of quote you like. This is just for unit test examples. So I'm going to write a variable called attributed, and here we'll pass in whatever quote. You can type in, I'll type in James Baldwin. And here now we create a citation. So it'll be similar to this. I can grab and copy paste that, and instead of passing quote as int, we'll pass the attributed variable we have defined above. After that, we can use our chai's assertion is string call to make sure that we have the value of attributed to be a string. So all we need to simply pass is the variable here. So we'll call assert is string, and we'll pass in citation.attributed. Remember, we want to test property citation, property attributed of citation, not this variable, because we know that this variable is going to be a string. We want to see after we actually create a quote. And we also want to make sure that, that the value of this variable and the attributed property of citation are exactly the same. So we'll call assert strict equal, which also checks the data type. We'll pass in citation.attributed, and we'll call attributed. And this should actually not be quote because we're not passing in the quote path. We're passing in, we're passing in attributed. And a quick little tip, if you have objects of the same property and value name, you can simply pass in the property like that, and it will know that it's equal to the same thing. So perfect. We'll do that for this is actually attributed here. We'll do the same thing for our source. So describe, we're going to be testing for a source path. A lot of spelling mistakes. It's hard to type and talk at the same time, guys. Apologies for that. So we'll make sure that it's a string as well. It's a string. Pass in the callback function. And here we'll type in the source. I'll type in notes of a native son. We'll make a citation as well. New quote, and we're not passing a quote or attributed, we're passing a source path with the same source content from this variable. Okay, we can do the same thing we did for our attributed test is string citation.source and assert.strict equal that the property source of citation is the same as the source variable we defined above. Let me add my semicolon here. Perfect, so we can save that and move on to step 14. So let's go ahead and run our tests. Okay, so we see that we have assertion errors here, which is good because we haven't actually gone to actually writing our model stuff here. So the assertion errors indicate that these properties here are not the same as the source values here. That's because there's no paths for attributed and source. So we actually have to go to our schema and specify our attributed path, which will be a string, and our source path, which will be a string. So let's go ahead and save that, and then we can run our test again. And we are good to go. We got 5 passing tests. So we got our model and we got our server layer test passing. So here in test 15, after we run the test, we see our work payoff and our tests are passing, but our feature test is now failing. And we got that right here. So this is our feature test. Bring this out here a little bit more. You can look at your feature test here in the test folder, user visits index page here. This is failing because there's no access to the database from the feature side of what we're doing actually here. So in order to make this pass, all we have to do is uncomment some of the configurations in this file here, which is our configuration file. And we also need to change some stuff in our environment configurations, which should be in the bin folder in this file here. So I'm going to bring those out. I'm going to close a couple of these guys so we don't cluttering our text editor. So all we have to do is actually give access to our feature level to the functions, our hooks, and we're going to start actually using them here. So when we actually uncomment these guys, we'll be able to connect and disconnect. And make sure you save this. And we also need to change our code here. We have to uncomment some of the stuff in our configuration for the environment. Don't get too crazy into what exactly the configuration in this file is. This is simply configurations for a node environment. So when you actually run the project, is going through certain paths and certain configurations. So it's a comment line 13. We'll uncomment line 33 and line 35 here. Go ahead and save that. And then let's run our test again. It might take a second. Okay, we got our 5 passing tests and that we worked with previously. And now it's running our feature tests. And we got our test passing. Okay, awesome. That concludes our project. And so we covered a lot in this project. We covered a lot in small chunks here. So we went through our model and server testing layer. We went through how to create actual models and schemas. Now this is a very basic skeleton of how a model is constructed, which is very useful. We can use it. You can even use this as a boilerplate if you actually want to mess around and create more paths and attributes to it. If you want to go the extra mile, like I said, you can add validators and mess around with previous methods that you actually learned in the previous lessons. We went through how to implement the model in our server layer. So if we look in our server tests right here for, routes, right over here, we saw to actually persist data when we make post requests. After making a post request, we can actually create an instance of our model here and make sure we are at a resurgence here. So this is a really great way to actually go through the process of test-driven development, because we're working as we write the test, we have an idea of what kind of feature we want to implement. We write a test for that, and then we work through the testing to actually write the code that's going to make it pass. So that concludes it for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.